I had the opportunity to interview one of my good friends, Mike Hansen. He is one of the kindest as well as one of the most genuine people that I know. He works for one of the leading aerospace companies in the Houston area, Intuitive Machines. And in this conversation, he taught me a lot about the current state of space exploration, as well as where things might go in the coming years. He also taught me a lot about life in general. We talked about how he decided upon his major in undergrad, his experience with moving to a new state for work, as well as his time living abroad in Europe, trying to navigate a new culture and language. In addition to being very smart and genuine, Mike is also very wise, and he's thought deeply about a lot of really interesting topics. In this conversation, we discuss things such as kindness, goodness, cynicism, naivety, nature versus nurture, soulmates, and much more. I hope you enjoy the following conversation as much as I did with Mike Hansen. So you work for a company called Intuitive Machines, and I was looking them up a little bit, and it sounds like their mission is to get like a unmanned payload to the surface of the moon. Is that correct? Is that what you guys are working on?
Yes, that is correct. That's our primary objective right now.
Okay.
And so what we've kind of some history, I guess, with Intuitive Machines, because I think it'll kind of guide the company and what its objectives are.
Yeah.
So it was started by two guys, or I guess essentially three guys, two of them from NASA.
Okay.
So Tim Crane and Steve Altimus. And essentially they left NASA to create their own company. And their original company was, their thoughts was, well, let's apply what we have learned and what we did from in the space industry just to other aspects of life. And so really what they were doing was just building autonomous machines, hence intuitive machines.
Okay.
But I mean, they would do things like drills. Their biggest focus was like drones. But then NASA came out with with their CLIPS program, which is kind of this branch off or this supporting branch of for the Artemis program of building the lunar base.
Okay.
So they were going to award companies essentially funding to build these unmanned payload vehicles in hopes that they could utilize them to bring equipment to the moon to start building these lunar bases and whatnot. And to kind of kickstart a lunar economy, really mostly. And at that point, you know, the founders of the company said, hey, this is right up our alley, and shifted their focus to be solely a space-focused company.
Interesting.
So they really pivoted there and won the contract, won two of the CLIPS programs, actually I think three contracts. And so, yeah, our primary focus right now is those payloads for the moon.
And that's all kind of directed by NASA. Like NASA is the one that's trying to, the Artemis program, is that what you said it's called?
The Artemis program, yeah, they're a major funder in that regard. But like the payload landers themselves, theoretically, will move more towards a self-sustaining platform. So the idea is that people will pay to put payloads on these and move them and take them to the moon. And so even for those three missions, we have different people lined up who are paying to take their stuff to the moon, whatever it be, whether it be science, projects or whatnot, from universities to government and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember someone was talking to me maybe like a year ago, and they were saying something about this lunar mission trying to go to the moon. And I was like, I'm not sure that's correct. I don't think we're going to the moon. And so I just had no idea that the NASA was even focused on like a lunar project. So I guess my question is like, what is the big push to go to the moon? Like I've heard of Mars, and I guess I haven't heard a lot of things, but the lunar project, like, is the main goal scientific research? Is it to get people like living on the moon, like habitating the moon? Is it like a waypoint that we can then go from the moon to Mars? Like, do you know what like the big overall objective with the lunar project is, I guess?
Yeah, it's probably dependent on who you ask what the objective is,
Yeah.
because I think everyone has their own, objectives in mind.
Yeah.
But a big one is just kind of a push for humanity, pushing humanity forward. And so I think especially if you put it as like thinking about it as the future of humanity, right? Right now, we're very dependent on Earth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if something was to go awry, and we're getting increasingly better at allowing global shifts in the world itself, nuclear wars or whatnot, or even just global warming, you can talk about that and say, well, humankind's getting more and more capabilities of being able to rapidly transform their global environment.
Yeah.
And is there a point where we where we can't reverse it, or it's a chain reaction and things go south fast? And so if you look at it just from that perspective, and you think about how long it takes to become an interplanetary species, it's you can't decide that you're going to become an interplanetary species overnight. And so you need to focus on it early on. And so there's that interest itself, but then there's just, I think, just the interest in the unknown innovation that occurs, right? And so if you think about like the space program in the past and what it's brought to us, I mean, satellites are a big one that we use every day, all day today. It's such a fundamental part of our lives.
Yeah.
We don't even think about it. All, became possible through space exploration.
Yeah,
and so,
it's true.
a big question is just like, what else is out there as we move forward, try and innovate?
Do you feel like the kind of the arena of space exploration is moving more private versus more government? And I guess what is NASA's role as we have these new companies start up? I was also under the impression there weren't a ton of aerospace companies, but since living in Houston, I'm realizing there are a lot more than I realized. I thought it was just like SpaceX and NASA.
Yeah, no, there's quite a few. I mean, there's like the big dogs like SpaceX, and then Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos, and then Virgin Galactic.
Okay.
And so there's the bigger companies, and then there's kind of the mid companies, which I'd call like Firefly, Axiom's getting there.
Okay.
And then there's smaller companies that are up and running, and who's to say how many of them are going to live or how many of them are going to die out? But I mean, it is exciting though that you are getting a push of the space industry into the private sector, right?
Yeah.
And so, I don't think anyone knows how it's going to fall out, but we have certainly seen more innovation in the last 10 years than we did in the last 50 years prior to that. To no fault of anyone, I would say. I just think that government funding is geared a lot towards public perception and public interest. And so in a Cold War, when, people had this mentality of, oh, we've got to beat the Soviet Union, a lot of money gets dumped into it. And then once people think that, we won that race, they just lose interest, and no one really pays attention to it. And because there's like no immediate benefit that they see from it, right? Kind of like the questions you just asked. It's like, oh, what do we do out there,
Do you feel like it's still like the race mentality that's driving aerospace companies now? Like first person to get back to the moon, first person to get to Mars, first person to build a space colony. Like, is it still kind of like a just do it to be the first one that does it kind of thing? Or are there kind of deeper motives behind it, do you think?
I think that is probably the main reason why the government's willing to fund things like it. I would argue though that it's not the reason why the private sector's in it, right? Because people like Elon Musk is not in it to be the first.
Yeah.
If there's a lot of interviews with him where he talks about like, hey, we're already so far in life and we're not an interplanetary species. Like, come on, like it's been 50 years since, all this other stuff and we haven't done much with it.
Yeah.
And so I think on the private side, it's more of a passion. of the innovation.
Hmm.
But certainly I think what's enabling that from government funding is a competitive nature, especially with China.
Like the U.S. wants their name on the team that goes to Mars, for example.
Yeah, well, and yeah, that's
Yeah.
a fair way of putting it.
Interesting. Yeah, do you think that NASA will kind of like fall to the wayside almost? Like I was talking with someone else recently about just the kind of parallel between like the United States Postal Service and like Amazon, for example. Like used to be if you wanted to send a package, it had to go through the USPS, but nowadays if you want overnight shipping, like I mean the ones who have maximized overnight shipping is the private sector, and the like government mail system is not super incentivized to innovate or be competitive in that sense. Do you feel like NASA will almost take like a back seat, or do you think it'll just turn into just like a funding machine where it just sends money to these private companies? Or do you think NASA will always be like a central innovative like force in the aerospace world?
Yeah, it's certainly up for speculation, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone's wondering. I would say NASA's probably headed more towards like an FAA type seat in the space industry, where we'll start seeing them take more of a regulatory role, and certainly like a funding role early on, right? And so, so something I actually learned just a couple of years ago that was really interesting was, like cargo planes. Initially, what really got them up and running was government funding, government projects to get them moving. But now the private industry has kind of learned to adopt and utilize them, that they're self-sufficient. And I think that's what the end hope with like the space industry would be, is as private industry kind of finds its use for this new field or this new arena, the funding will not need to be as intense from the government or solely funded by the government.
Yeah.
And the space industry will kind of find a self-sustaining existence.
Interesting. What made you want to go into like aerospace back when you were deciding what you wanted to do with your career and your major back in college? Like what was the draw for you for aerospace?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's certainly different than most people in the space industry, I found, right?
Really?
Because I feel like most people like in the space industry, well, I knew one guy who said it best. He said, you don't do it for the money. It's people who are in the space industry do it for the passion. And so a lot of them were like these kids who just grew up loving space, loving rockets, loving missions, and every mission that ever launched. I was not one of those kids. I actually was initially went to college to do civil engineering. You know? And the long and short of that was I felt like I was probably like indoctrinated into it more than anything. My dad was a civil engineer, his dad was a civil engineer, so on and so forth. And so I was like, like this is what I'm gonna do. And like in my first semester, I remember I was in their intro to engineering, civil engineering class. They were going through the different engineerings that you can do in civil, and I remember there was one day I was sitting there and I was just like, I do not want to do this with my life. And I knew enough people in the mechanical engineering department. I went to Utah State University, and so they have a rather large mechanical engineering department. And so just talking with them, I found some interest in what they were doing. And the nice thing about mechanical engineering is it's extremely broad.
Yeah.
So I thought it was kind of a more safe bet, jack of all trades, master of none is kind of mechanical engineering in my mind.
Yeah.
And so I went into it, and about my senior year, I really thought I was going to do like the thermal sciences, like thermodynamics, heat and mass transfer. So I was talking to one of the professors that was in that, and I said, hey, I'm interested in this field. For my electives, what can I do? And at the time, Utah State University had just gotten rid of their Thermodynamics 2 class.
Okay.
It's like, actually, I just got off the phone with people, because there's interest in these fields, but we don't have too many classes to support them, elective classes. He said, the best class you can take is compressible fluid flow.
Okay.
Which is thermodynamics.
Sounds like an easy class.
Yeah. Well, And the reason why it was like thermodynamics too is because it was a major study of rocket engines, right?
Gotcha.
And that's a big thing that you kind of study in thermodynamics is, you know, like the energy balance and conservation of energy from these engines and how you extrapolate and optimize your use. And so, but I loved it. I just fell in love with the class, and so I took propulsions, advanced propulsions, and started going into, you know, optimization courses, controls courses, navigation courses, and kind of just went that way with it. So it was really not until my senior year of my undergrad that I fell in love with the space industry and got an emphasis in it, and then did my graduate in aerospace engineering.
That's really interesting. Yeah, what advice would you give to someone who's kind of in that position, maybe just started college, not sure what they want to major in, trying to figure out where to go, so many options?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you ran into it too with college. It's just like kind of paralysis. There's so much you can do. And, you know, one way, the feeling that I had when I was kind of approaching it in my life was like, in high school, you can almost feel like your life is like in this pipe, and you're water. So you've got a lot of head pressure, and you've got a lot of energy, and it's all focused in one direction, and so you feel like you're really making progress.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you hit the end of that pipe, which is like college, where it's like you can do anything, all of a sudden you have all the energy, but it's getting spread out into everywhere, and you just feel like you're getting spread so thin, and there's just like no movement. Even though you have all this energy, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And
totally.
And for me, I think the big thing was, you know, with an unlimited number of possibilities, your statistical probability of finding the thing that is just perfect for you is probably like none, is zero. But, you know, humans, I think, are so adaptable, so capable of, you know, working their minds, you know, in different ways, especially when we're young, you know, our brains are still developing.
Yeah.
That as long as you find something that you enjoy, you're good. You know, it's again finding direction and moving, because if things are just not working out for you, it is not what you enjoy, you can pivot, I think, rather fast. And I think what's most important to know is you're never locked into something. I mean, especially with an undergrad. I mean, how many people actually go into what they studied for their undergrad?
Yeah, it's true.
And then even with your PhD, I had a friend who once told me, it was Cole Blakesley. He got his PhD in nuclear engineering. And he was kind of struggling with this too when he was getting his PhD, because he was concerned about getting locked in, because like with a PhD, you've specialized, you know, you wrote a dissertation on like a very, very specific thing that pretty much not even the professors that are, you know, on your board know as much about as you.
Yeah.
You know, they know the subject, but not that very specific subject as much. But he did talk to a professor who was getting his PhD and I don't remember the subject, but it was like a very specific up-and-coming subject that actually fell flat shortly after he got his PhD, and completely pivoted and has a very successful career in, I think it was physics. And one thing he said was, when you get a PhD, you're not telling someone, I am an expert in this field. You're telling someone that you give me a month, I'll be proficient in a subject. You give me 6 months and I'll be notable in that subject. And so, I mean, even to something as extreme as PhDs, I feel like you're never locked in and like you're just doomed to that thing in life. What's more important is that you have momentum and direction. And so, you know, take your time to think it out, think what does interest me, and then move with that, you know, get some direction with it.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
So, talking to you, you said when you were in high school you were a tutor throughout your 4 years of high school, and then, or during that time, and then when you were in college you were also a tutor for some engineering students. I've had the chance to see you teach, and I feel like you're a very competent teacher, very effective teacher. What do you feel like are the components of an effective teacher? Like, what does it take to, what are the important aspects of being a good teacher?
That's a good question. I think number one, you've got to like love the subject. And you've got to take the time to understand it deeper, right? Because you think you know a subject pretty well until you start trying to teach someone about it.
That's true.
And they start asking you deeper questions, and you're like, I have no idea. And I think one thing is never bluff when you don't know something, because you're never going to know something about a subject perfectly, especially as a undergrad teaching undergrads.
Yeah,
you're definitely not going to know everything. And so don't bluff and lie to them. But I think a big component is if someone asks you a question you don't know the answer, say, I'll get back to you. And try and find out the answer. Because number one, that it just increases your depth of knowledge. But then probably people afterward would have similar questions or the exact same question. Now you can answer it and you become more competent. So,
yeah.
I think a big part is always being upfront and wanting to continue to learn yourself. But then also, I think a major component there too is encouraging them. You know, like when they ask questions, oh, great question. And then like when they find out something, even if it's something minor, like they solve a minor problem, you celebrate it, right? Because in my mind, well, it is proven, I guess, in many ways. But, you know, like positive reinforcement is so important. And, you know, it's when people feel like they're going to get mocked or feel stupid for asking questions that they bite their tongue.
Yeah.
And then, or if they feel afraid of making a mistake in, you know, trying to answer something. That they stop doing it. And then, you know, they have that same paralysis in their progress. And so I think just a big thing is not noticing their mistakes or not making a big deal about it.
Yeah.
But really like encouraging their solutions or their questions.
That's really interesting because I feel like just in my time in med school, I've seen a lot of the opposite type of teaching that you're talking about, where it's a lot of guess what the teacher's thinking. Do you know the specific fact that I'm quizzing you on right now? And like 9 times out of 10, like you don't know the answer or you get the correct answer wrong. And yeah, all it does is just kind of convince you to, it makes you feel like you don't actually know anything. And it makes you very much more reluctant to speak up when a question is asked, versus trying to give your learner like little wins to encourage them and give them that kind of confidence and motivation to keep trying, I guess, rather than just giving up and not even giving it a shot.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And as you said that, like 2 professors came to my mind for my college years.
Yeah.
One of them was my heat and mass transfer professor, and one of them was my linear algebra and differential equations teacher. And I mean, linear algebra and differential equations teacher was like known for being a hard teacher. You know, there was a shirt that had her name as like, I survived so-and-so's class, like that people would wear.
That's funny.
And one thing that bugged me about her teaching was that, she would exactly that. She would focus on these like little like nuances in linear algebra and differential equations to trip you up, when it's just like, this is the first time I'm learning about this stuff. I'm still focused on like the main like overarching principles, and you're hitting these small details. It's like, so then you just start focusing on these small details and you're kind of missing the big picture and you don't really know what you're studying, which was a big hit for me because, you know, what I do is a lot of linear algebra and differential equations. So a lot of that learning I had to do again in my engineering courses.
Yeah.
Whereas like my heat and mass transfer teacher was a little bit different, kind of more what you're talking about, where he was rigorous, he was tough, but he was like a lot more focused on, you know, those more core principles and helping you understand those and being more understanding that like, you're going to get lost in the sauce a lot. So, I mean, even if he like says something and like 2 minutes later someone asks a question that he had just answered, I mean, he even stopped once and said like, I realize you guys aren't hanging on every word, and then just answers the question. You could feel he was a little deflated from it, but really instilled like a joy of learning in that sense.
Yeah, I feel like that's like such an effective or such a critical part of an effective teacher is being able to help your learner maintain that vision of the big picture. Because you can get so lost in the sauce or lost in the weeds, and it's just, I feel like that's one thing also I found in medical school. There's so much that you have to know as far as like facts, that you can spend like so much time studying all of these facts, and then someone asks you the most simple, overarching, basic question, and you don't even understand like the main concept behind it because you were so focused on memorizing all these little details. So, anyways.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it would be nice if like in college you could almost like take a class and then like later on like audit classes.
Yeah.
Because I mean the first time, no matter what, you're so kind of lost. And I don't know if it's the same for you, but I felt like, especially in mathematics, it's like they're trying to teach you like these basic principles, and you're still trying to figure out where you're headed with them. That your reconstruction of what they're trying to build just gets so jumbled, and by the end of it, you kind of understand, oh, this is what they were getting at. And I mean, but you're so focused on building that base that you've really missed a lot of the key principles. And then just being able to go through it one more time where you're like, I know where it's headed.
Yeah.
And now I know like what to focus on, would be so helpful.
It's almost like watching a movie the second time after you know the plot and what actually happens.
Especially like a Christopher Nolan movie, right?
Yeah, you can actually understand what the heck's going on. Yeah. That speaking of mathematics, that's a good segue into my next question. Talking with you, I've realized you're much smarter than me when it comes to mathematics, and you know a lot. When it comes to mathematics, how does mathematics influence the way that you see the world? Kind of an interesting question. Do you feel like it does affect the way that you see things? I feel like a lot of times when I talk with you, there's always some mathematical explanation behind kind of why you think something or why you understand something.
Yeah, for sure. It's I think it kind of goes back to that original concept of, especially when we're younger, we're a lot more malleable.
Yeah.
And like as we go through, I guess what we choose to spend our time doing helps formulate how we think.
Yeah.
And because mathematics and science were such a big part of my college years, I think it really influenced how I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, for sure. I think it has helped with that. And so, yeah, for sure. I think my thinking has really been based in a lot of the mathematics. It kind of helps me also now understand the world and make like applications that I can understand in ways where it's like, oh yeah, it's just like this, and things click. Because I think like there's like, I mean, there's that understanding that you get where you just kind of understand a principle, like you understand the metadata of something where it's just like, oh yeah, this, and you can recite what you've learned. You don't understand it. You know it on such a high level. And then there's that moment where it just kind of clicks, where you're like, oh my goodness, now I understand.
Yeah.
And the other way I like to think about it is like, like if you threw out a whole bunch of puzzle pieces, and it's like you could pick up any puzzle piece and like describe that puzzle piece really well and tell exactly what's on it, the colors, what it probably fits to, the different sides. But then once you start putting them together and you start seeing this big picture and how things like connect and how things interwork or interweave, it's like then all of a sudden you start really understanding it.
So do you feel like your understanding of math has helped you understand the bigger picture behind things?
Yeah, for sure. I think it has. Like the world as a whole,
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it's interesting.
Like I think a big thing is like I think a lot of people who think of like math folks or like science people are like, oh, they're so rigid and so deterministic in their thinking, like everything needs a solution, everything needs this,
very formulaic.
And like I think one thing I've learned, and I'm by no means an expert in the field of mathematics, but I did gain a lot of comfort when I watched the podcast with Edward Frankel, Lex Friedman's.
Okay.
So he had this guy, and he very, very well noted mathematician in our day and age.
Yeah.
One of the best. But you know, he kind of hit on something very similar, and so it was somewhat of a confirmation for me, you know, because you know I still definitely consider myself a greenie when it comes to the field of mathematics and whatnot. But you know, a big part of that was how little we know, and you know how many holes there are just in our understanding of the universe. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Mm-mm. No.
So it's this idea that, you know, in mathematics you have axioms.
Okay.
Right? And what axioms are kind of the laws that you take for granted. Like 0 is a number.
Okay.
And so they're the basis for mathematics. And from them you're supposed to be able to derive anything in mathematics to prove concepts, to prove theories.
Okay.
Now, what they one thing that Gödel came up with was, well, is mathematics complete, and is it consistent? Which is, can you prove with the axioms that you can prove anything in mathematics? And then, is it consistent? Can you make sure there's only one proof, right? Because if I can prove one thing, but I can also prove its opposite,
yeah,
then is my mathematics at fault? And the long and short of it was no. You can't. And so they're like, well, for those things that we can't prove, maybe we can just make them an axiom.
I feel like that's cheating.
Well, in some ways it might be, but I mean, there are certain things that
you can't prove them because they are an axiom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
they are the things you prove things with.
Yeah, exactly. They're the tools, or you know, it's like you need a basis to start from. But even that, moving them to an axiom, you just open up a whole new realm of new things that cannot be proven. And so there are these concerns, I guess, or so there is, concern is a good word, I guess.
Yeah.
In the field of, you know, things aren't all deterministic as we want, and you know, I think it proves that we're really not in control of the world as much as we think, and we should be okay with that.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Pivoting a little bit. A few years ago, you moved from Utah to Houston to begin a new career. And if I understand this right, you didn't really know anybody in the area. What was that like, going from a place where you'd grown up, gone to college, have family, have friends, to a place where you don't know anybody, new coworkers, new experience, new culture? What was that experience like?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've usually been kind of a more quiet, you know, to myself person growing up, and so, you know, perhaps for me it wasn't as daunting, but you know, it's never not scary to go do something like that. To go, you know, go somewhere where everyone you know is at least a 24-hour drive away from you.
Yeah.
And you don't know where you're going, you don't know the layout or anything, and then to add on top of that, you know, there's always that concern when you get a new job of, am I good enough, right?
Yeah.
Especially, you know, for me, you know, I found that a big component of my life is, or a big driving motivator for me is not letting people down. You know, and so when I have my major professor who had recommended me for this job, and you know, this company that hired me on as a navigation lead, you know, which is a big job just right out of college. One of my biggest fears was not to let people down, not to let the company down who, you know, put so much faith in me, and not to let this professor down who had, you know, essentially recommended me. And so there's definitely a lot of worry moving to a new place. I do think that probably that concern eclipsed the concern of will I know people, a new culture, and probably because I had had that experience before, so I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I went on a mission for my church, and so young men and young women have the opportunity to go on these missions for 18 months for girls and 2 years for guys. And I had that opportunity, and the church sent me to the Netherlands and Belgium. And it was, again, that was probably the first experience of, just graduated high school at age 18, went to college for a semester, and then went out on a mission.
New place, new culture, new language,
yeah,
new people.
Yeah, and it was more of a drastic, change.
You can't even drive.
You can't. Yeah, you can't even drive.
You got an ocean between you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so you've got an even further distance. It's a completely new language. Culture is much different.
Yeah.
And and so I think that was probably the big shock for that. But then after being able to do that, I think moving to Houston, that shock was more mitigated. Or manageable. That's a good word.
Would you recommend that a young person do something like that you said you'd been to one semester of college or so before going to the Netherlands for this mission? Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it was formative for you? Like just leaving behind that safe existing structure? Would you recommend people do that? Like kind of seek those experiences out to travel when you're young?
Yes. Yeah, I would. And I would say probably the purpose is more important than what you're doing. Yeah. Because I think that the bigger thing that helped me in my life for that experience wasn't necessarily going to a new culture, which was very useful and very insightful, because I think when you grow up in one place, even if it's just the United States as a whole, you've got a sample size of one.
Yeah,
right.
True.
And you base the world off of your experiences. You have nothing else to pull from.
Mm-hmm.
And so when everyone you see has this kind of cultural mentality of, the North America, that's what the world thinks. And then once you go see different cultures, and the Netherlands was a really good experience because they have people from all over the world. I knew one guy who kept track of the people from different countries that he had met, and it was over 100.
Wow.
And so, you'll meet people from the Middle East who are born, lived there, and have just been in the Netherlands for a year, like you.
Yeah.
And so just being able to see different cultures and that people really do think different, and that, our mindsets are so relative to where we grew up and how we grew up, was very eye-opening. But I think probably the bigger component for me was the purpose, was kind of being able to, learn those cliches in life, I guess. Because growing up, you always hear about, like, what's most important in life, right? Like going beyond yourself. It's not money. It's, passion. It's drive. It's purpose.
Yeah.
And you hear them so much as a kid, they almost become cliches.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as humans, we have this tendency to think that if something's common, it's not important, and I think it kind of comes from the basis of materials. Like gold or like these other precious materials
are
that
rare.
Have uses. Yeah.
Interesting.
It comes from the supply demand
of
material things. But, I guess more emotional or, I guess more fundamental things to our existence are different in that manner where, we have thousands of years of human experience.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of pretty well figured most of it out. But it's the difference between learning that metadata and connecting it and applying it.
And you almost have to learn it for yourself sometimes before you realize how important it actually is.
Agreed. Yeah. There's that element of kind of stepping in the dark.
Yeah.
Which is like another thing that I think most people don't think that, like, math and science people think about, is that step in the dark, that step into the unknown.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, that's what you have to do, like in innovation. Like, how crazy is it to think that time is relative. How crazy is it to think, like that there's like these little, vibrating strings that make up the universe.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds crazy until you get used to it, or until you see some proof about it. And then all of a sudden, and string theory is definitely not proven. I just want to go on the record to say that. But yeah, and so in every aspect of our lives, we have to kind of be willing to put in a little imagination and be able to step out in something that we're not quite sure of.
Yeah, that's really cool. What advice would you give to somebody who's making a move similar to the one that you did out to the Netherlands, or you did out to Houston, where so many things are changing? People that you know, place that you live, maybe new job.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give to someone in that situation?
That's a good question. I guess the first question is did you do it well?
Well,
because everyone's going to probably have advice, but you probably want to mark the advice of the people you want to emulate.
You seem to have accustomed pretty well to the Houston area.
I appreciate that. But, I think a big thing is, establishing your routine early, or establishing your lifestyle early and holding to it.
Yeah.
Because it's super easy just to kind of come in for the first month or so and be like, oh, I'm still kind of figuring it out. I'm going to take it a little easy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you just start, after a while, you learn that you've developed these habits that you don't like, or they're not beneficial to you.
Yeah.
But they were the things that you were going to kind of just use to break in. And now they've just become integrated. And so definitely not utilizing that mentality and saying, no, it's like early on establish, what do you want? What do you want your lifestyle to be like? And then just right at the beginning, setting up those bounds and setting up that kind of a lifestyle.
It's interesting, yeah. It's like an opportunity to create new habits, even. Like something that you wanted to do. I remember when I made like a big change in my life out of high school, I was like, I moved to a new place. I said, I'm going to start flossing. With that change, for some reason, it was so easy to pick up flossing every night. Whereas up until that point, I was never consistent with it. But because it was such an abrupt change in my routine, so many new things were happening, I was able to like sneak that habit in. And now it's like just like a part of my life. I always floss at night. But it happened at the kind of transition point, the shifting point that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I totally agree with you. It's like when you're set in a routine, it's like you already have like this inertia or all this energy going in this direction of what your current lifestyle is. And to change that direction requires so much more energy, But then when you move and like all of a sudden your whole routine comes to a halt, it's like that all of a sudden stops. And it's like, okay, well now I have the chance to completely change my direction. And so being able to find the things that you haven't done in the past and, hey, I want to do this. It's a great point.
So interesting. Yeah, I've even noticed when if you ever move into a new apartment or, I don't know, move into a new office space or something, the first 48 hours, maybe like first week or so, is when, if there's something wrong about that place, that's like the only time you're going to fix it, in my experience. Like if something needs to be replaced, you need to get new furniture, you need to clean something out. Like there's so much motivation in that first short window to make it the way you want it. But if you don't address an issue in that first week or so, at least in my experience, I just never get to it. No, it's like that weird adjusting period where so much can happen, but if it doesn't happen, like you're saying, it just like almost, it's like cement, and then it just solidifies. And you might get stuck with bad habits if you're not careful, like you're saying.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Yeah, and so I mean, yes, those early on states where you're very malleable, it's important to establish what patterns you want.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Okay. This is a very genuine and sincere compliment. You are one of the kindest people that I've met. Why are you so kind? And is it something that you think about? Like, do you try intentionally to say, when I'm interacting with this person, I'm going to do it intentionally kind, or is it something that is just natural to you?
I think it's definitely intentional, and I think it's probably that way with most people. I think you have to make a choice to be kind in ways.
Yeah,
I appreciate the compliment, by the way.
it's true. Yeah.
Well, and it's a particularly good compliment coming from someone who I would consider also super kind,
Well,
like
thank
a
you.
good person, and so like just fundamental at their core. And so certainly I'd like to get your thoughts on it too, if that's
Yeah.
that's okay during one of these. But
Definitely.
for me, it's definitely a conscious choice, and it's I go back to that kind of a mentality that I learned from like Jordan Peterson, where it was just like the virtue is in the choice and not doing the action, right? Because if you're just kind by nature and
Yeah.
that's the only thing you could
Yeah.
ever do, there's no virtue in it because that's your default. That's what you would do. But if you make the choice to be kind, that's where the virtue is, because you can be very malicious. And, I think it's like, you can't sugarcoat it. I mean, the world has had really rough and ugly things that occur in it,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a dark side to humanity. And I think it really is in all of us. And so I do think it's important that you make the conscious choice of what do I want to be, and make the conscious choice of, the world's, the world can bite you,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to be aware of that, be conscious of that. And so it's super important to always be able to establish, self-respect or, boundaries with people, and, be willing to stand up for yourself
Yeah.
and make sure that that is in your foundation, but then also being kind, and, you can make the world a better place or you can kind of make it a worse place.
Yeah. That's really interesting because I feel like it's very easy to get stuck in kind of the valley of cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
You go from kind of that naive, it's not a virtue because it's your default, like you were talking about. Well, everybody's kind, so I'm going to be kind. And then as you get older, you realize that not everybody is kind, and people are malicious, like you're talking about, and treat others poorly. And then you can fall pretty quickly from that place of naivety into a valley of cynicism. And I guess that's where the choice has to be made, like you're saying.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I like to call it, just the way I rationalize it is like the parent paradox. Because, and the reason I say that is because like that's like the most prevalent place I've seen it in my life, where it's like people, like when you're a child, your parents are the gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can do no fault. They know all things.
Mm-hmm.
And you just kind of look up to them in every aspect. And
Yeah.
then you kind of grow up and, everyone has like the rebellion phase in their teenage years, but that's not where I really think it occurs. I think it's like after you leave your parents' house and you start establishing your own life, you start to learn that, yeah, they weren't perfect. Yeah, they made
Yeah.
faults. Yeah, this, that, or yeah, this is what I would do different. And you can easily fall into that, well, my parents were horrible people, and you just swing the other way. And I mean, I think it's natural that most people will at some point. But the true thing is getting back into, yeah, okay, they weren't perfect, but they were good people. And, certainly not everyone's parents, perhaps are like,
That can be
depends.
said about them
Yeah,
necessarily.
yeah, depending on what your definition of good is, and that's probably a whole discussion that we could have for 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
But understanding that most parents try and do their best, with their kids, even if they fault at it, and kind of relearning that kindness or that justice towards them, but in a more realistic foundation. But I think that's in all aspects of our life. We kind of have that, as you called it, like that naive
Yeah.
belief in it, and then we hit the reality, and we have a lot of people just kind of stay in that second stage where we've swung too far to the other side because of that cultural shock from that, naive state. And we just kind of remain there because we feel like this is what life is and I'm not going to get bit again by being naive. But then
it's almost a security. It's like a defensive mechanism in a way than the cynicism.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. And then, but like, the true heroics or the true virtue is kind of swinging back to the center of saying, this exists. This world isn't as naive. It isn't this perfect naive world.
Mm-hmm.
But the fundamental principles of good are still there. They're just more realistic, and building that realism into, your altruism.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you do that? How would you what advice would you give to somebody who's stuck in that cynical valley? How do you climb out of that? How do you swing back to the center?
I mean, that's always a really hard.
It's like a question of life, really.
Track to make. And speaking of better experts on subjects, I would say that of the two of us, you're the better expert in that field, and so I would love to get your thoughts on it too. But I mean, just so again, just emphasizing it's, I guess, from my experiences, and there's really no backing that anyone should take from it. But in my mind, I think the big thing is establishing, again, that self-respect and that those boundaries in yourself, right? Because I think with a lot of those naive beliefs and then that harsh reality, you've probably been burned in some way by it. And that's why it's like such a stark swing. Yeah. As you said, it's a defense mechanism because you were hit, And so I think the first thing is in order to be able to trust yourself to swing back, you need to have some kind of belief or some kind of fix in your mind that you can protect yourself against that. Yeah. In some way. Because if you're trying to step out and go back to that state without understanding a defense, it's kind of more suicidal than anything. Yeah. It's stupid.
It's a big risk to be willing to take.
Yeah. And I think, you have to kind of be realistic and try and find, well, how did I get bit? Like, what are the equations of motion or your underlining principles in this that govern these things? And then when you have that, you can feel like, okay, I feel like I have a protection against these things, so I'm not going to get burned again. But then when you step forward, I think you have to realize I am going to get hit again because I don't understand this perfectly. Yeah. But do I live in ignorance or do I mitigate my chances of hurt and know that every time I get hit, as long as I can like analyze it, it's going to lower, the pain, and I'm going to get hit less, and I'm going to become more powerful. I'm going to become more capable. Yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that's something I've thought a lot about, and I feel like maybe another component to add, just the idea of kind of what you were getting at, the underlying goodness in the world still exists, that you can kind of almost combat the cynicism with kind of that belief in, I guess, like the positive underpinnings behind some actions that you might find even negative or things you're trying to avoid. Because it's easy too, I feel like, if you go out with your defense mechanisms or weapons, like, I can take on the world again, to engage in kind of this like combative mentality, you against the world. And that's exhausting too. That might not be the cynical valley where you're stuck. Like, you're making progress, you're interacting with the world again, you're collecting data like you're talking about, but it's still very much a battle. So I don't know, somehow shifting the entire perspective to say it's not the world against me, it's somehow we're all on the same side, there's goodness still, and
we're all
people
just making
around me.
Mistakes and we're burning each other.
Yeah.
It's true, and and kind of going along with that, I think you kind of have to shift that mind of victim, because like when you get burned by something, it's super easy to be like, you kind of get hit with that like victim, or like, oh man, I was like violated, or I was like, I feel like kind of vulnerable.
Yeah.
Whether it was just like, someone broke into your car, or
Yeah.
going back to the parents, like it was like, oh my goodness, like,
Mm-hmm.
you just kind of feel vulnerable, stupid in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, understanding, I guess, what happened and protecting against it helps you, enable you. But then, yeah, you need to have that mentality of, I'm a force in this, I have a cause in this and I can change it. So what do I want it to be? And then I think you kind of take on more of a proactive approach to it. And then, yeah, I think that's kind of where that, the goodness aspect of it, I guess, really comes in is, well, am I just going to put up my shield and kind of like what you're talking about and just survive until this life is over?
Yeah.
Or am I going to try and make it a better place and be like, hey, this is what I want this world to be like, and I'm going to kind of be the one to at least start it in my part of the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, I might get hit a couple of times, but it's, that purpose is worth it.
It is interesting how you can never go back to that state of naivety, that state of ignorance. Like once you fall off that cliff or swing to the other side, you can't go back. It's interesting. You either have to continue onwards, like you're saying, or you're stuck.
Yeah, agreed. And, and it is always good to compare with your childhood because that's where it mostly exists. But like, everyone thinks of their childhood fondly, it was always so much fun your biggest concern is what cartoon to watch, in the morning.
Yeah.
But even as a kid, you can remember longing to be an adult, longing for that autonomy, longing for, that kind of power and control of your life.
So true.
And I think even now we like it, because it's like, whenever you go back to, your parents' house or something, and you feel like you're being treated like a kid.
Do, and
it doesn't feel, you're like, and so there is definitely like a very good experience about kind of taking that control and leaving that naive existence, even though it was a little bliss.
Yeah.
But you got to take the good with the bad, I think, if you want more joy, you got to take on more sorrow. And I know that we've kind of talked about that before a little bit. But yeah, you can't selectively numb in this world.
Yeah. It's true. Okay. Couple more questions. So I found out in preparation for this podcast, chatting with you, that you have 8 siblings.
7 siblings.
7 siblings.
I'm the 8th.
So there's 8 total.
Yeah.
What was that like, growing up with 7 siblings?
Well, I never knew any different, so it's hard to compare.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it. There was always someone to do something with.
Yeah.
And that was always fun.
It's probably just very normal for you to have 7 siblings.
Yeah, well, and it certainly helps, like, early on learn how to interact with people and how sharing and compatibility goes.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, what role does, I guess, what's the importance of family in your life? Just in general.
Yeah, it's, well, I of course, yeah, it's super important to me. Like, my family's really close. I mean, it's not to say that isn't friction, like what family doesn't have issues.
Yeah.
But I think it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about. Do you keep the wounds open, or do you let them kind of heal over and learn from them? And so I think family is super important. And in fact, I had a conversation with a friend once where it was kind of like a nature versus nurture discussion, but we phrased it in the way that if you could perfect simulated worlds, like on a computer, and you could, start out with your initial conditions of your life, play it out, and it played out your life exactly. And then you went in and you did an infinite number of simulations where you just modified one tiny thing. And there's always something different in the life. It was, okay, so what does your state space look like, essentially? Like, how many different versions of you are there, and what's like high density areas of you? Like, how many of you got a PhD? How many of you are a bum on the street?
Yeah.
And then, of course, where's the change? Like, where's the significant deviations in the types of you? And, you know, our end conclusion was a lot of it starts starts early on in your life, you know, where you're malleable, where I think a lot of your perception of the world is initially built, you know, as your brain is being developed and as you're discovering the world for the first time. And so I think family is such an important part of that. But also just beyond that, like there's perhaps besides a spouse and kids, there's no one else that has, which is a subset of family, I guess, too. So family in general, there's no one who has like more time with you. There's no one who sees you in more different environments. And so like a family is someone who has seen you at your worst and seen you at your best. And whatever your state of your relationship is with them at that time, like number one, that's probably a pretty good indicator of you as a person and how compatible you are. Or how compatible, you know, how well you can work with people on a deep level.
Kind of gives you practice almost for going out in the world on your own.
Yeah,
gives you kind of that training space to work in as a kid.
Yeah, I think so. But then it also kind of gives you that reassurance that I can always go back to them, right?
Yeah.
You know, because your family is someone that you feel like, you know, depending on again that end relationship with them. But ideally what it is it's someone that you can go back on and say and rely on because they've seen you at your worst. You guys have had nasty fights, and hopefully the relationship is good. You guys have resolved them to a point that your relationship's very realistic beyond that naive interaction that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
And you know they have your back.
Yeah, I love that. I've thought about that before as well. You know, when people talk about like, oh, well, where do you want to raise your future family? Do you want to do it in this state or that state? Do you want to travel? Do you know, travel? I think those things are important to think about for sure. But I think my conclusion has come to like ultimately wherever I end up, the most important thing I think is going to be how my family, our family, me and my future family, like we interact as a unit, regardless of the interactions that happen outside, whether, you know, where we live. Because I agree, I feel like that's so formulating, like for who somebody becomes is kind of what happens in that family space. So, yeah, super interesting. Okay, a couple more questions. Actually, maybe let's just finish with this one. What are your thoughts on love? And do you think there's such thing as a soulmate?
Interesting. No to the soulmate.
No?
For sure, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think the world's deterministic like that.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, like the fact that you know, so many things have gone into making you who you are, and you're so multi-dimensional. Yeah, I think it's really improbable that it's like, okay, of all these infinite, you know, possibilities that you could be.
Yeah, like you were talking about all these different, factors that go into who you end up becoming.
Yeah. And then just, you know, and like, I mean, even if you just thought about it like in dimensionality, like, you know, like one dimension of your personality is maybe your kindness, or like one dimension of your personality is how driven you are, or how, you know, your sense of humor, you know, or whatnot. And then just having all of that and having someone that like overlays with that perfectly, and there's only one person, it just seems improbable to me. And then also just the fact that, okay, let's say that there is a soulmate. Let's assume that people are born and exist just kind of on a uncorrelated basis where, you know, it's just completely random.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so how many billions of people have lived on this earth, and how many of them do you come in interaction with, not only by constraints of, you know, land and space, but by constraints of time.
Time is huge, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like the probability of you meeting, you know, a soulmate just does not click for me.
So how do you think about it then? If there's no such thing as a soulmate, what is there, and how does somebody find the person that they want to be with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so for me, I think it kind of goes back to a very similar mentality of what we talked about with like schooling and what you pursue for education, for work. It's a lot more the effort you put into it and what you make of it that's more important. But then also with that, I mean, there are certain things that make it easier, and there are certain characteristics that can make it impossible to work with. You know? And so one thing I've typically told people, and I would take it with a grain of salt, you know, I am still single, so.
Well, me as well, so.
Yeah. This is there's definitely still a component of us figuring it out, and I'm sure, you know, people.
Which I think a lot of people are, to be honest, particularly in you know, our age group, you know, kind of like your mid to late 20s. You think you would have had this part at least figured out already, but you don't. And so it's kind of this journey of rethinking the way that you thought about soulmates or love or dating in general, and trying to figure out how the heck do I go about this. So anyways.
Yeah, for sure. And we won't go down that tangent. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And so, I mean, for me, I think kind of the big components that I look for are, like, number one, do they have core principles? You know, because those things you should not change for any one person, for anyone. You know, those should be like what you live by. Yeah. And
those should line up.
Yeah, and those should line up, because you shouldn't change it for anyone, and it's really hard when you guys have very, very different core principles, you know.
And what would you say is a core principle, like being kind, like or how you interact with people, or like I guess my question is, what values are core values or core principles, and what are negotiable?
Yeah,
in your mind?
And I would probably say it's like what I would boil down like core principles to is what drives you, and it's like kind of what would you not give anything for, you know? Yeah. And it's like, what things are the things that, it's like, no matter who offered me what, no matter how tough life gets, these are the things I want to hold to and not change in my life.
So it might be kind of individually based rather than like universal.
Yeah.
Like someone might need to have a driven partner, like drive is critical. Yeah, and absolutely. Some might be able to compromise in that area.
Yeah, and you know, some people might like probably unconsciously want like, I need to be loved by everyone that I meet, you know, and like a big driving factor of how they live their life is being liked by everyone. Or being loved, you know, like, and so they'll do anything that anyone asks them to do in order to be liked by them, you know, and, you know, probably one that no one wants, but sometimes we accidentally fall into, you know. Or another big one is like, power. Like, I want to be someone of power. I want to be someone that when I walk in a room, people know me, you know, and like, that's what drives them. That's what motivates them. And so, I think a big question is like, what is your purpose? Why do you get up? Why do you go do what you do? That's kind of like a core principle of you.
That's the first step, maybe. And then you find someone that matches or is complementary to that.
Yeah, agree. Complementary, I think, is a really good word there. And then the next thing I would say, though, is they're willing to discuss with you. They're willing to be open-minded. They're willing to change things for you, you know. Yeah. And it's important that you have both of those, because the core principles should never move, but anything else they should be willing to work with, to discuss, you know. And I think it's so important, and something that perhaps we don't understand as much in our day is the difference between like a full-blown angry argument or like belittlement and like a discussion. Yeah. Like where you guys are like, it's okay to have differing opinions and to be different. I mean, that's where economy of ideas comes from. That's where you learn and grow. Yeah. Is where something that you believed is being challenged. We should be able to look at it and be like, well, hey, if it's not right, then I should throw it away. But if it is right, it should stand any scrutiny and still be resilient.
Interesting.
And so I do think that discussion is super good. And then, but then also just like being willing to do something you don't like because it makes them happy, you know? Like, and one of the things I think about was there was a girl I dated, and we were talking, and one thing she said is like, "You just do not text me." Like we meet up, we talk, but then like once you leave, like I don't get texts. I don't.
Yeah.
Hey, how's your day? How are you? And it's like, oh, I hate texting. I hate my phone. And I think most people who know me know that, like, I'm a horrible texter, and like I just never
I
respond.
can relate to that. Yeah.
And so, but for me, it was like, yeah, I hate this, but I know it's important to her now, and so I'm going to start doing it. So I made a conscious choice to do it, because it was important to her. And I think you have to have that in a relationship because there's no soulmates. You're never going to line up perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you guys need to find compromise and but be willing to discuss your things instead of bottling them up and letting them blow up at one moment.
And some of that is the fun parts of the relationship too. I think if it's done correctly, that can be more stimulating and more valuable than a relationship with zero disagreement or thinking exactly the same on every topic in every situation. That might get kind of dull.
Yeah, how boring would it be to be like, marry yourself?
Yeah, it's like you already have that. You want something that's a little bit new.
Yeah.
Something that's challenges your perspectives, like you're saying.
Yeah.
But they can do it in a safe way to where it's not that belittling like you were talking about. It's the discussion that can...
Yeah, it's like a constructive building and improvement of one another.
Yeah.
Instead of, like as you said, belittling.
Yeah.
And I think that's just like such an important component of that. And then of course, like probably one of the big things I always look for when I'm interested in a girl is I like to just sit and observe them and how they interact with people that they're not necessarily interested in, especially guys that they're not interested in, because I think that's such a telling part of someone's personality. But then also it's like good for the future, because like if you marry someone, there's going to be a point
where they don't like you,
where they hate you. And it's like, okay, so if you're super rude to everyone that you're not interested in, like every guy, and you come over and you're super nice, it's like, oh yeah, you're nice now because you want something.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a time that you hate my guts, and I'm going to be that guy. So I better figure out how you work.
It's interesting. So understanding yourself, what core principles drive you, and then finding someone who lines up but is also willing and able to discuss the points that don't always line up perfectly and compromise when necessary.
And compromise on things that aren't core principles, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a concern too, is if someone really doesn't have something that they live by or stand by, and they're just willing to change their whole life, because then the concern is like when storms come, do they just take the path, of least resistance and you're by yourself?
Yeah.
They're not someone who's going to stand by you.
It's almost like the core principles give you the security to make that jump and that commitment.
Yeah.
Knowing that so many things will change. That's I think something that's daunting just getting into any relationship, is realizing I'm a different person than I was 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Like a lot of who we are just evolves and changes. Situation, we grow up, we change our mind about things. So you have to assume the person you're going to end up with is also going to change. You hope they will.
Yeah, I agree.
But you want to see also some consistency and some security and those things that are really critical to you.
Yeah, for sure. And you're absolutely right. I think there's a component of security that you kind of need there, that, this is someone who has my back. Kind of going back to the family, it's like someone that, I know is going to help me, is going to support me in what I'm doing and what's important to me, and they're not going to be constantly fighting me or belittling me for what I believe and what I'm, what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah.
Because that's got to be probably the worst component ever, is if someone just fundamentally is in disagreement with what you feel like your whole purpose is in life. How hard is that?
Yeah.
And it's like they're not helping you. They're not. You guys aren't. That's not a constructive relationship. And then the other big question is, why'd you get it in the first place? Because obviously it wasn't for that core principles.
Yeah.
That should be what we kind of focus on initially.
I think that's great advice. Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks for chatting with me, coming on the podcast. It's been super fun. Appreciate you sharing all your advice and knowledge with all of us. So thank you.
Well, appreciate it. I appreciate honored for being the first guy here, and
Yeah, it's an honor for me too to have you on the podcast. So thank you.
well, I told you once before, but I'm going to say it here so while I'm on record. I think this is going to be awesome because I think you're a super insightful guy too, and
Thanks.
you're always very methodical, and I think you're very experienced in multiple realms of the world. And so you've thought about multiple areas of life, and you have insightful thoughts on them. And so I think that you're going to be a great host, and excited to see, what you guys discuss.
Thank you. Well, I feel the same way about you. So it's been fun having you on and hearing what you have to say. So thanks.
Yep. Thank you.